It's the final installment. I know it's been a long time. It's been 8 weeks rather than the initial 5 or 6 that I thought. And I'm pleased to say that Professor Grayson has also joined us tonight. Because I have an idea of what's going to happen after this, because it's not going to be goodbye at the end of this. It's going to be something else. But I just want to sort of go back again, because I'm hoping that whenever you started to do the course, that you had no idea where Brown Square was, or its history, or its people, or its stories. And so from a globe that you didn't know where it was, you now know the story of the people of Brown Square, warts and all. You know, you have from the original Jimmy Hope and John Brown, you now know roughly where Townsend Street is. And tonight we're going to fill in the last of the blanks and find out how the West Link, which is part of Brown Square. So every time you drive up the West Link, you're driving through Brown Square. And also Belfast Met took a big slice out of Brown Square and find out how that happened. Okay, so I'll just stop that and hopefully we're on a roll here. Okay. Everybody see that? Yep. Sorry, just 1 second. Has anybody seen Gareth Boyle coming on the call? No, I can't see participants. No, that's okay. It's fine. It's fine. So it's the very last tonight. Thank you very much for joining me. So just a quick recap. What had happened was that the City Council and Terence O'Neill, had decided that they wanted to change the face of Northern Ireland and modernise it, because they knew that things like the shipyard, the old industries were going to die out. They also decided to do that, they would need an infrastructure system. Hang on. They also needed an infrastructure system that would mean that vehicles, especially lorries, because Northern Ireland had been decimated as part of the railway cuts. So the old railway links were gone. So the only thing that was left was cars and vehicles. Lorries had started to come on the road, and articulated lorries had started as well. And so they needed wider roads to do that. Unfortunately for Brown Square, they've decided to drive one of those roads right through the heart. Now, some would say it was by accident, but I don't think so. And I can understand some of the reasoning behind it, because Brown Square some of its housing was really poor, and they've done a favour of actually knocking some of it down. And this is the plan. That's the actual plan for the Ring Road, as it was called. You can see how they were coming in from the M1, going down through the West Link, straight out and onto the M2. And the same with it was going to be a new interchange here, you know, over the M3, that takes you out towards Hollywood. So it really was trying to link all these together. But you can see that the decision to do this, if you look at this clipping here from the Belfast Telegraph, at a meeting behind closed doors last night, the City Hall Unionist Party decided by 21 votes to 8 to support the motorway plan. The decision was taken after members were given a detailed rundown on the implications of the scheme by officials from R. Travers Morgan and Partners, who we know held a lecture. That was there you go. That was the lecture. Who submitted the Ring Road blueprint, and City Hall officers, including the town clerk, all agreed with this. And also they were looking for scapegoats. So 20 here viewpoints on city's traffic. And what they did was they blamed the buses. So Sir Robert McConnell said that if it wasn't for those buses, we'd be able to get our cars into the city centre. And that actually was the problem, because you had then people who were starting to work in the city centre and offices and retail outlets with cars. So they needed somewhere to park. And unfortunately for Brown Square, that's where they decided it was going to be. And you can see this is the original plan for what was going to be redeveloped. It was a lot more than that. It actually took in almost all of this area, okay, with the exception of Boyd Street. It stayed intact, but the rest of it was decimated. You can see that they then had no plan. Okay. They didn't work out how they were going to do it. And you can also see then that for the final plan for the 80s, they decided they were going to build a series of flats and masonettes. Now, there was no one to speak for Brown Square. There was no one on those committees, and those who did said nothing. And whenever those committees were meeting and making these decisions, some of the people on those committees actually owned property in the area. So this was recognised as a problem, and it went to Stormont to say that you can't have people who are going to benefit from the wholesale destruction or relocation of areas to actually sit on the panel that'll make the decision. And the Stormont government approved it. Hence, it was done behind closed doors. So what did it mean for Brown Square? It was a very famous picture, and I love this picture because it says, no demolition beyond this point. And it's used extensively by people to say, well, there was actually a big movement in the Shankill Road to try and save the Shankill Road. Unfortunately for Brown Square, this is the end of Brown Square, just at Townsend Street. And I'm going to demonstrate that not only did the urban plan have a big impact on Brown Square, so did the next thing to come, which is the Troubles. But this is a pull back from that shot. So you can see the exact same spot, Townsend Street. This was an engineering union headquarters, believe it or believe it not. This is the Shankill Weetabix flats, as they were called, because of the shape. And that's where I met my wife, by the way, just there. So that's another scene of crime site, as I say. So this is the same scene, okay? And this is 1969. So you can see Townsend Street, the same. So here you can see, and this is whenever loyalists attacked the RUC and the B Specials. And you can see the B Specials, they're the guys with the motorbike helmets on. You can see that a bus has been run down the hill towards, past the army. You can just about see the British Army here being deployed, because by this stage, the police couldn't cope with the loyalists. And additional to that, you also had previously, so this is the first RUC man to die in the Troubles, the present Troubles, sorry, the previous Troubles. He was called Victor Arbuckle, and he was shot dead by a UVF man called Thomas Tucker Roundtree. And this is the same building, okay? So it just happened here on Peters Hill at Brown Square. So the first RUC man to be killed. But he was killed by loyalists. The British Army was deployed. They were sent mainly because the government of, by then, a guy called Brian Faulkner, had looked at the past and already studied what happened in the past when it came to internment. You know, and according to these politicians, in the past, internment had worked, plus repression using the Special Powers Act. So a combination of repression and internment, they think, defeated the IRA. And it did then. The problem for them at this stage was that this was now a modern world. This is a world where TV cameras followed everywhere. Things couldn't be done in secret. And whenever internment did happen, it was an absolute disaster, because what had happened was that the Prime Minister at the time had warned Faulkner that if internment didn't work, he would bring down the Northern Ireland government and impose direct rule, which is essentially what happened. But you can see here the army deploying up and through at Peters Hill. So where the first constable was killed would be just about here. And this is the British Army as they deployed. Now, this is where I have a great deal of fun, because it says the British troops arrived on the streets of Derry in 1969. But you all now know, because you've done this course now for 8 weeks, that is Townsend Street. So there you have Townsend Street Church. And I know Bill Sterling's on the call tonight, because that's his mummy's shop there. That's where James Patterson lived, who won the military medal. So this is actually the regiments deploying out. And this is the same regiment that was deployed whenever the Hearts of Steel riots were taking place away back in the 1740s, the 1760s. If you remember the story about the militiaman getting his ankles cut open, this was the same regiment coming back again 250 years later. So I know that Gareth has just joined us from the Heritage Lottery Fund. So welcome, Gareth. I don't know, Gareth, you want to say a couple of words first before I go on?
Thanks for inviting me on tonight again, Francis. From what I've been hearing, now everything's been a success for you in terms of what you've been doing this past while, and the dedication to this is something else in terms of what you've done. I want to wish you and all the participants every best wishes moving forward as we come out of lockdown and things start to look up again, and hopefully you'll be able to get your site visit shortly as well. And
yeah,
maybe myself or maybe a representative of the fund could maybe just participate as well, maybe and just go along as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we would like you to do, by the way, is there will also be a certification ceremony for us.
Okay.
So if you would be kind enough to come along and present the certificates, I'd really appreciate that.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, we'll get something sorted. But yeah, from the two that I dipped into now, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's, you know, your knowledge is big and vast in terms of you're very passionate about what you do, and that comes across. So thank you, and I'll hand back to you. Good to see everybody tonight again.
Okay, thank you, Gareth.
Thank you.
So why was the British Army deployed into Townsend Street? Well, we know that Townsend Street had been an interface, you know, a peace line that had been saddled, you know. So the Coaches Street, the jig, if you remember the jig that was the resident magistrate had insisted be closed down, would have been just about where these soldiers are passing by. And the background of this is because of what happened in Northern Ireland as the Northern Ireland government had become cemented in, and we went through all what happened with Northern Ireland. But then civil rights had came to the fore, you know, that there was a change that, for example, Gerry Fitt had taken the place of Lieutenant Colonel Woods as the representative for West Belfast and for Brown Square. And the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was formed in 1967. And it also had support from the IRA, you know, which isolated it from a lot of working class Protestants. But incredibly, you know, the same conditions for most working class Protestants were exactly the same as working class Catholics. So its aims were universal suffrage, one man, one vote, an end to the gerrymandering of electoral boundaries that seen, if you think back, a lieutenant colonel getting voted out because he was gerrymandered out, a repeal of the Special Powers Act, and the disbanding of the B Specials. And if you remember, James Patterson was in the B Specials, and an end to religious discrimination in employment, and a system to deal with complaints of discrimination. And I can vouch when it comes to, for example, in the shipyard, in our department, there was 250, of which 30 were Catholics. So that gives you an idea of what it was like here. So what did that look like on the ground? So along we come with Paisley, because one of the big mistakes is that people say that the Troubles began in Derry in 1969. And I'm going to prove to you that they happened and began in Brown Square a long time before that. This is what's called the Battle of Divis Street, and it happened in 1964. And what happened was someone put a tricolour into an advice centre in Divis Street, and the Reverend Ian Paisley decided that he was going to force the Northern Ireland government into taking that tricolour down. Technically, the tricolour was illegal, I think at the time anyway. But the problem was that the police didn't want to get involved because they knew they would do more damage than enough. The result was what you see here, the Battle of Divis Street. And I can vouch for what the Reverend Ian did. So this is Boundary Street, and this is 1967. So that's my mother, my granny, my father, that's me. And my father was the master of his lodge that year. And they had collected for this arch. It was the best of its type. And if you look, it was connected to our house. And they invited a young up-and-coming minister to open the arch. And he came into our house, borrowed my mother's chair, and that was Ian Paisley. And right here was a band, a small band, accordion band, It was a great night. There was a bar at the end of the street, Owen Duffy's, who opened up his bar. There was Coke for the kids and crisps and the drink. You know, there was bottles of beer coming out for the men. It was a Catholic bar. And Paisley started to speak. And essentially within 15 minutes, a happy crowd enjoying a real fantastic atmosphere became a mob. As Paisley then said, he demanded they should march down into Divis Street to reclaim Ulster. They did march down. He marched the other direction, and they were slaughtered, you know, literally, because it was always an interface, and you know that now by the 8 weeks of this course. And it was very easy for to wind up a mob, and that's exactly what happened. I'm proof of that. So in 1968, there was 15,000 of a demonstration for civil rights. There was growing tensions that the old order of Stormont was coming to an end. There was a radical people's democracy march where, you know, you had the PD, the People's Democracy leader, Bernadette Devlin, was elected. All of this was seen to be a fault of the O'Neill administration for being too lax on Catholics. And that's why whenever the troubles did start, you can see here, it was UVF who actually bombed the Northern Ireland electricity and water installations like Silent Valley and also Dublin. And as a result of that, then O'Neill, as part of an election disaster, when Paisley almost unseated him, he resigned and then became James Chichester Clark, which is a strange connection to Brown Square because the Chichester and James Chichester Clark actually is the same Chichester family that was the Donegal family that gave John Brown Square to begin with. So a strange connection. Well, did it work? No, it didn't really. And this is where I'm glad Emmanuel Conway is on the call tonight. Because in Emmanuel's words, this particular attack happened in early 1969. So Easter, 1969. The Junior Orange Parade in the photo started the riots that day without even leaving the Shankill Orange Hall, which was about a mile or so away. The Shankill Defence Association, SDA, organised an invasion of Unity Flats, which is borders on Brown Square, on the pretext that the Junior Orange Parade had been attacked, even though it hadn't left the Orange Hall. John McCaig was the organiser. To cut a long story short, 6 days later, on the 8th of August, the Orange Order released a statement admitting that the parade had not been attacked at the time. It had passed unmolested during a lull when residents disengaged. But by then, it was too late. The touch paper had been lit. And you can see John McCaig, who was shot dead. You can see him along with top-ranking UDA members. So you can see that's Glenn Barr, who led the UWC strike. And in the back there, that's Andy Turry. And Andy Turry and the Turry family came from Greenland Street, so just beside Brown Square. And you can also see another actor and someone who destabilised the state. And that guy's called Major Ronnie Bunting, who's beside Paisley here on the steps of Stormont. And I have a story to tell about him, but you have to wait until we get the city cemetery before I tell the story. You have to wait for that one. So what did that look like then at Brown Square? So you had people like the Calderwoods, and you had people like the Reverend Rogers, who was my minister at the time. He was a minister in St. Stephen's Church. And this is the riot that took place that night. So in there, in the photograph of the Calderwoods in the background, there's Billy. You also have the Grogans. You have the Skees family. So, you know, I must have been, I'm in there somewhere. But what I do remember is whenever the CS gas was deployed that night, the Reverend Rogers came up from St. Stephen's and he honestly believed that he had the power to stop this. And so my mother was the sexton of the church. So she accompanied him up to here, to this bar. It's the Diamond Bar. You'll still see it if you go up to Shankill. This is where Kentucky Fried Chicken is now. And he marched out in front of the mob, put his arms out wide and demanded that they stop. And this guy here, one of the Calderwoods, floored him with one punch. That was it. So the crowd had stopped to see what was going to happen. And the days of a minister keeping control I've said a minister, a proper minister, keeping control of a mob like that, it had long passed that stage. And so the British Army was deployed. And again, it was one of those misnomers that the British Army was deployed against the Catholic people. So I'm going to hopefully nail that one down as well, because the British Army were deployed in protection and to try and separate both groups. So this particular photograph here, you can see this is in Millfield. So you can see it's a wedding arriving. They must have been down to St. Mary's, but you can see St. Stephen's Church in the background. You can see the Technical College. One of these shops here would have been with the young Fianna met of the IRA in 1919. You can see when the British Army, this is the people of Brown Square cheering the British Army as they marched down, not realising what was about to happen next. Okay, this is the British Army deploying on Divis Street. And the point I want to make about this is if you look at the photograph, okay, you can see the same soldiers, is exactly the same regiment that deployed in 1760, but a military policeman is accompanying them and watching every single move. There was a big control factor in that, which sadly was not to be when another regiment moved in. And you can see this is the soldiers in their base in Townsend Street. It was known as the Golden Ball Factory. For Brown Square, the British Army deployed against Brown Square, as you can see. So you can see that the outpost is actually looking up towards the school, and this is Sackville Street. And one of those weird twists of fate, the Calderwoods who lived here, they used to come across, Molly Calderwood used to come across, the soldiers would have let down a string and they would have sent up tea and biscuits to these guys here. So everybody else was throwing stones at them and the Calderwoods were throwing tea at them. So, you know, and you can see that even then, the old battle lines that had been Brown Square, that have been settled. You think back to the last lecture with Noel McCrae, there was this knowing, you know, where you go and where you don't go, what day you go to, you know, prods can go to Pat Carroll's bar on the 12th, but on, you know, on St. Patrick's Day, stay out of it. That all broke down at this stage. So you can see here, charges arising of the weekend's disturbances of Belfast were dealt with when four men appeared in Magistrates Court. So Brendan McCabe of Donegal Street, who tried to grab a soldier's rifle, was sent to prison for 6 months. So you can say he pleaded guilty to a charge of disorderly behaviour and behaviour likely to cause a breach of the peace on Coaches Street on September the 28th, because by now the battle lines had really been drawn. And I found this wonderful clip. It's very short, but it actually shows a moment as the British Army marched down Townsend Street and the people of Brown Square cheered them on. Okay, very short clip. Found it by accident.
God.
You want to see that again? What I liked about that was the commentary to say when the first marched in, they were greeted by Catholics and they were showing all the women from Brown Square. I thought that was hilarious. And this is the reality, you know, this was the reality when the army deployed. This is John Street, or Hamel Street, you know, and essentially the army, I said this before, they are a very, very blunt instrument. They do what it says on the tin. Some of them aren't very bright. Certainly when the army was deployed at this stage, there was no fire control orders, like the yellow card. There was a series of cards, the white card, yellow card, green and white card, that as a British soldier you had to learn before you were deployed on the ground. You also had to train on what's called CQBR ranges, which are miniature Belfasts. There was none of that when the British Army first deployed. It was make it up as you go along. And this particular photograph here, this is Boyd Street. And you can see the Technical College behind. And this is the original peace line from the 1920s that the Catholic houses were burnt out. And you can see this is now the front line. This is a peace line, which I will show to you whenever we do the actual physical tour on the ground. This is the reality down at Divis Street. So you can see the church, St. Stephen's in the background. And you can see by the end, the army had taken up fixed positions. So the army would have actually, this particular spot here is just here. Okay. But at Brown Square, the other end of it, you still had this. Now, my original house in Woodford Street would have been that house there. Okay, so that's the barracks where D.I. Nixon was based. So you can see Unity Walk had become a flashpoint. Divis exactly as it had been from 1815 onwards. And this next clip, what I'm going to show you is the result of that. So this is Wilson Street. If you think back to the Hussars had charged up and cut down people with their sabres in the very last charge on the streets of a British city. And this is, as I say, this is the top end of Wilson Street. And these are the people of Brown Square. These are the people of Brown Square. You can see the police are on one side, the British Army on the other. They had built a barricade on exactly the spot that the same barricades would have been built in the 1920s. And if you go down there today, and I will be taking you there, that's exactly the same place as where the barrier is for Belfast College to attack. And it's right there. So the peace line has evolved, from burning people out and leaving blank spaces to building homemade barricades. And then the British Army came in and removed all of this. As you can see, it's very one-sided. They removed that. They actually then brought in sappers, engineers, who then put in these structures, which is like stakes down into the ground. The whole idea being it would last no more than about a year. Here you can see the people at Brown Square and the soldier down. The soldier, quite understandably, he's panicking slightly. But I always like this because you can see how the old arches had actually been used psychologically as a barrier. They actually started fulfilling their purpose. And this is what the army found. This particular guy here, I traced him. This is Fusilier Paul Hurdlesfield. This is him at Townsend Street Church. So this is the actual gates. You'll be seeing these gates. That's him at St. Stephen's Church. We'll be hopefully get into St. Stephen's Church. Because they were based in there, the church was attacked and that particular hall was burnt out. He himself was injured in a riot just at Divis Street and has never worked again from that point. So that's from 1972. And this is another shot of Townsend Street, as Townsend Street then had been cleared. So here you will see James Patterson's house. And you can see how the urban blight that you're about to find out began then to actually destroy. And the British Army encouraged this as a process because they needed people to move out of these interface areas and clear it for a clear field of fire. So they encouraged people to move away. This is the night where the last real tangible Catholic community in Brown Square was taken out. Emmanuel, can you remember the date? Is that's October 1969, isn't it? Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me or not. It's October. The problem for the British Army was they were deployed to keep the sides apart, but they could not use lethal force. And so whenever you had 200 of a mob, unless you had rat guns, which they didn't have at that stage of the game, they only had the SLRs. The only option they had was to use lethal force. Now, I don't know the right way of that. I hope to work with Emmanuel Conway to find out the right way of that, if he's up for it. But that would be my take on it. But that's something I would like to try and discover, if possible. This is the result. So the old community of Coaches Street, the last totally Catholic area, was totally destroyed in one night. You can see then the army then sent in the sappers because they realised that these temporary barriers weren't enough. And so they erected then the permanent peace line, which is I will still take you to that exact spot today. There's still a peace line there. It still serves the same purpose. Whenever these particular soldiers moved out, this regiment, they then rotated in the next spearhead battalion, and that was the Parachute Regiment. And at the time, they then took over Brown Square. So those houses that the Catholics had formerly been in were knocked down, and they then built their own barracks and a jump tower so they could practice on. I remember I was on that jump tower. And they also decided, because they had learned from Vietnam, that they would try a Hearts and Minds campaign. And so the commander of the Parachute Regiment at that time opened the Jig. That place that had been a bone of contention for the better part of 50 years, where fights had happened. And he opened it as a cross-community venue called the Paradise Club. And this is the only photograph I have of both Catholics and Protestants in the Paradise Club, as run by the Parachute Regiment in early 1971. Now, a minute, hang on, late 1970. Okay, so if you get my book, you'll be able to see the regiment and the regiment numbers and stuff like that. Unfortunately, the regiment then was taken over by another commander, who then decided he was going to scrap the Hearts and Minds campaign and instigate a campaign of tough love. And so very shortly after that, then Ballymurphy happened. Then the Paras opened fire on the Shankill Road, killing at least 2 people that we know of, one of whom is my father's friend, by the way. And then the army was deployed to Derry, early 1971, the Parachute Regiment, and we all know the consequences of that. But I know whenever I'm teaching in Derry, I actually bring the transcripts of the trial, the inquest, into the 2 men who were shot on the Shankill Road. And when we get into the bog side and we get down to where the Free Derry is, I read the transcript out and say, well, where do you think that happened? And of course, they all assume, well, this happened in Derry. This is Bloody Sunday. And I go, actually, no, that happened on the Shankill Road. And there's a real tension there, and that you'll discover. For example, you'll see big campaigns about Soldier H. You won't see any of those banners on the Shankill Road, because essentially the UVF put all Parachute Regiment soldiers under the death sentence, and told if they were able to get them, they would execute them on the spot. So that's one of those unknown parts of history. The troubles then really hit Brown Square, and as you now know, because Brown Square was on the front line, as it had been for the better part of 200 years, it then became the front line again, which meant that if you were going to target people, you had a very simple way to identify who was a Protestant or who was a Catholic. And this is what happened. So one of the gangs who did this were called the Shankill Butchers. And they entered the premises of, so this is Brown Square. Sorry, it's there. So here you have Brown Square. There's a church. There's Townsend Street Church. So Brown Square School is here. There you have a place called Hall's Brush Factory, we'll talk about in a moment. And this is Casey's bottling store, where they actually bottled Guinness.
Yes, that's it.
And so on the 10th of October 1975, Nanny Murphy and Bashir Bates, amongst others, arrived at Casey's bottling store. They went up the stairs. Now, my father bought his Christmas drink every year from Casey's, and I knew these 2 lads. And this is because it becomes personal to me now, because I knew these 2 lads, and I knew the 2 women who worked up the stairs. So, Mosque UVF come in at their premises and singled out 2 sisters. Frances Donnelly and Marie McGrattan were daughters of the owners of the plant, and they also owned the Brown Bar, I think, on Library Street. The 2 women were forced to kneel, and they were both shot dead. They were shot both in the head twice. Murphy, who moved to the other part of the premises where they found 2 storemen, Gerard Grogan and Thomas Osborne, were in the bottling room. Both men were immediately shot. Grogan died instantly, and Osborne died 21 days later. This became the killing grounds for the Shankill Butchers. Now, that sounds very simple. It's not just as simple as what it seems, because if you think back to this particular photograph, so in 1976, the same Shankill butchers entered the Coleraine bar in Smithfield, and they asked the Protestants and the Catholics, the Protestants to go to the left, the Catholics to go to the right. And two of the Protestants who went to the right, one of whom was, this was my Akela in my Cubs. She was called Patsy Hood, and she was there with her boyfriend, Freddie Graham. So they were separated. The Shankill butchers who did this then opened fire. 5 were shot dead. Now, Freddie and Patsy wasn't injured, but for a year afterwards, they believed it was done by the IRA because so many Protestants were shot dead. But the dead were Jimmy Coyle, Edward Farrell, Daniel McNeil, Samuel Corr, and John Martin. And Roland Cargill, who was a Protestant who survived the shooting, in his words, what happened was they came into the bar with automatic weapons and shouted, "All right, prods to one side, Catholics the other." They then said to me, "What are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm a prod." He then put the pistol at the back of my head. I turned around and he fired and he shot him in the nose and he went down. Actually, the concussion of the weapon, he went down and he played dead. And that's what saved his life. And so the notion that the Shankill butchers just killed Catholics, I'm afraid not. I'm afraid by this stage, the dehumanization process was such that they considered anybody who was in their way as being the enemy. So too for this man. This is my cousin. This is Sammy Llewellyn. And Sammy was a joiner that worked for the housing executive. And he got a phone call one night. His yard was here in Brown Square. You're going to see it. To go up and help board up Catholic houses because there was a bomb attack by the UVF up in Dunlewy Street in the Falls Road. And so Sammy went up. We know he made 2 trips, but he never came back from a third. He was kidnapped, tortured, and executed. Now, the IRA has always denied doing it. I'm not sure. I know, for example, that such was the outcry, and his funeral is here. So that's his funeral. I'm in the car at the back here. So that's my cousin Solly. That's Stephen. That's Jerry Llewellyn. And you can see the primate of all Ireland, the head of the Church of Ireland, and the head of the Methodist Church accompanied this. It was known as the Good Samaritan kiln because Sammy was doing it. It was a Good Samaritan's turn when he was executed. And such was the outrage that the IRA approached my cousin and said, "Look, they'll pay for the funeral," because they disagreed with what happened. Now, at the time, there's been no reconciliation there. And when we go to the city cemetery, I'm going to take you up to where Sammy's buried. But again, just like that photograph of the army going into Derry, but we know it's Townsend Street, this is in the Andersonstown News. And so you can see it's linking a guy called Patrick Livingstone, who may or may not have been guilty of Sammy's murder. But you can see they're using a picture, and it's a picture of a UDA man, his funeral, that was killed. Now you can see Sammy's funeral, and you can see this funeral. It's 2 different cars. It's not too hard to spot the difference. But for someone casual outsider who's not done this course, you would look at that and say, well, this guy must have been a paramilitary. I know that's me. That's me there. And I do remember, you'll see a coffin. I can't remember what the coffin was for. I think it was something to do with, that's the burial of Sunningdale. But I do remember the coffin being outside just here. And this is this cortege. I can't remember. But I know that's the UDA, or the Shankill Defence Association, before it became what was known as UDA. At Belfast Met, Gary Smith had been executed by the IRA. Essentially, he had bought a new car and boasted about joining the RUC, and that was enough to have him executed. And unfortunately, he was shot dead, a young lad, just as he committed the attack. So you're going to pass that point as well. And then we'll come to this particular incident. And so I think in retaliation for what had happened at Casey's, then the IRA decided to attack Hall's Brush Factory in Wilson Street, that same Wilson Street where the Hussars charged up. And the Brush Factory had about 180, mostly young girls working for it. You can see the fun on the right here. And I worked for it as well. Now, I left school at 15 and started working halls. So I was 16 when this particular incident happened. And you can see at the time I was getting £17 a week. I gave my mother £7. I kept £10. And I was in there with about 120 young ladies. So it was great work and it was great fun. Unfortunately, in December 1976, the IRA turned up. The only thing, I was outside at the time, the only thing I remember was being dragged by the hair. I was hit in the face and then dragged by the hair. Whoever hit me from behind. And I was dragged into the building where the Protestants were all lined up. That's a picture of me, by the way. So I know that was the days when I had hair. Okay. And I'm sure Bill Sturnian will recognize the other guy there. It's George Potts. So we were lined up and we were fusing a bomb just beside us. And there was only one way in and one way out, but this particular place where we were standing. So if the bomb had went off, it would have taken a lot of innocent young girls with it. This guy here was called Roy Young. Roy was my friend. Roy was paraplegic. You can't really tell in this photograph, but you can see his arm is completely static. He couldn't move that arm. He also had caliper on his back. And although he looks as if he's walking there, he couldn't walk properly. He could only walk for about 100 yards. He got his photograph taken on the 12th day and then he got into a taxi. So Roy came around the corner and it looked as if, because of Roy's manner, it looked as if he was going to run towards the IRA man who had the pistol on us. And so the IRA man turned around and shot Roy twice in the head. My guess is this guy had been trained in the British Army or the police, because he double tapped Roy. So it was tap, tap, because he hit Roy twice in the head. We carried Roy out and Roy died just there at Wilson Street. My mother also worked there. So at the time, so that's my mother in Hall's Brush Factory. So there's no memorials to Roy. And whenever we do our tour, you're going to be covering this, because that's my pledge to remember not just Roy, but all the victims, no matter who they are, but all the victims, and all the victims all the way back to the 1920s. So what happened to them, the troubles with Brown Square? Well, what they had planned to do was this, which was a flyover. And this was the original plan, certainly as my mother had seen. But because of the troubles and because the executive, there was then what's called the Sunningdale executive had got up and running, the person responsible at the time was called John Taylor. And he gave the city planner the exact words, and here they are: I want an undercut that is wide enough that you can't throw a petrol bomb across. And so the original flyover that was supposed to go past Brown Square, that was going to have car parking and shops in it, then became this. So this is the undercut. So this is the West Link. So this is a peace line. So here you can see the peace line as is Brown Square. Now, this picture was taken about 10 years ago. But here you can see this became the peace line. This is a peace line. I'm going to prove it in a moment. So is this. This is now a secure home for people who are being discharged from a secure mental facility. You have a doctor's surgery here and a chemist. But again, it's the peace line. You have this as a peace line. This is owned by the Department of Justice. Nothing can be built here. This is where the Catholic houses were burnt out in the 1920s. This is a peace line. Again, this can't be touched because it belongs to the Department of Justice. This is Wilson Street. This is Hall's Brush Factory, where Roy was shot dead. This is where Casey's was. So this is the peace line, and you can actually see it here as it runs up to where the Catholic houses were in Coaches Street, which is about here. And so what was an informal peace line is now an institutional peace line, but you can't see it. And I'm going to show you exactly where it is, because when you're doing your tours, I want you to point it out, because there is a good news story at this. And this is Brown Square as I remember just before. You can see already that Brown Square Barracks, where D.I. Nixon was in charge, has now been knocked down. This is the old Lucky Phil Levi's pool shop, which is the last Jewish shop that I know of in North Belfast. It had gone by this stage. And you can see the IRA had planted a bomb. And this is exactly where the West Link is now. So the IRA planted a bomb here, right on Peters Hill. This guy here is Doughboy Collywood. You've met him. You've heard reports about him. You've seen him in the newspapers. He was in the army, British Army. And he had a horse running. And that was a Saturday afternoon. He had a horse running. And the British Army had closed the bookies because of the IRA bomb. So after waiting for an hour and a half for the bomb disposal squad to turn up, Doughboy got fed up, walked down with his dog, and this is Sheila the dog, lifted the bomb and carried it over and into where the old Brown Square Barracks was. And that's where the British Army Technical Army officers defused the bomb an hour later. It's one of those unique photographs, of a moment in time where the Troubles, the West Link, the Unionist Party had all combined to almost destroy Brown Square. And then came the bulldozers. So now you can see that the undercut coming from the West Link. So not a flyover. Originally, the West Link was supposed to run along this axis, but because officials could make changes in the plan, the elders from Townsend Street Church had demanded that the West Link be moved 50 yards to the right, 50 metres. It actually ended up 100 metres to the right. So instead of going past Brown Square, it went through Brown Square. So the church that founded Brown Square took part in part of the destruction of it. And you can see how well the underpass worked. This is the last rat at Brown Square. This is 2013. And I have one of the last bricks to be thrown. One of the last bricks that I kept. I took this photograph from outside my house. And you can see how well the planning on how the cattle riders works. Because essentially, these people had rided all the way up past Unity, what became Unity Walk. But the police then had them blocked off, both at Gardner Street and here at Brown Square. So there was nowhere for them to go, apart from over the bridge. And once they went over the bridge, the PSNI then moved in and blocked the bridge right over. That was the end of the rat. Now, the rat then took place within the Shankill estate, but it was away from the centre of the town. And so the original plans of an institutionalised peace line worked, and thank God, because we were the benefit of it, because I was more than pleased. Louis West actually was standing that night, shouting at them to get back home. So what happened to Brown Square? So this is the old Brown Square that I remember. This is Brown Square Barracks. It's almost decimated down. I would live about here. This is Lucky Phil's pool shop, and you can see the old Henry Taylor's works and the school in the background. The campaign, the Save the Shankill campaign, what happened was there was no campaign for Brown Square. And whenever the Northern Ireland government, 1972, made a vesting order, what happened was that all these properties then were worthless. Nobody wanted them. And so people moved out. Their houses weren't worth it. Anybody who was in a housing executive house at that stage were being allocated housing executive houses up in the Shankill estate. Only people who owned their own houses then stayed. That's all who were left. But they also were able to buy, because of what was called redevelopment blight, they were able to buy these properties for next to nothing. So houses were going for £5. Okay. So anyone who had money then started to buy up the properties around them. This is looking down Brown Square. You can see the old cottages here. They're still there. This is must be about 1970. This is Sands' fireplace. There's a connection there, but I need to discover that one. And so the redevelopment blight took over, but certain people stood their ground, and it's a tribute to them that Brown Square survives. And so I'm going to name those people. It was a girl called Lily Hagan and her husband John, and that's their shop. So they bought up the properties adjacent to them. And the Tone family, who bought up the houses adjacent to them in Gardner Street, they also then bought up these houses. Bobby Carnduff bought these houses, and they negotiated directly with the housing executive because they didn't trust anyone else to look after the Brown Square that they wanted. And they negotiated with them to the point where they said that they would then sell off their housing here if the housing executive would build new housing and bring the old population back. And that's exactly, well, that's almost what happened. I actually had William here. So that's his father. So that's Hagen's shop. Okay. And he came to me today. Actually, I was outside today. And I always feel sorry because he asked would I get a plaque put up for his mummy. Now, his shop was burnt out. I had applied for it to be listed by the authorities here. They turned me down. It was totally intact. It was 140 years of age. All the shop counters and everything else was all intact. It was then delisted, or sorry, it was never listed. It was knocked down, and it became a car park, which is what you see here. But that's not the end of the story. As for the Brown Square School, Brown Street School, well, this is the last real decent photograph of it. You know, you can see the old dreadnought bar there, as I would call it, because this is where you need to have an investigator's head, and I have. What happened was the old school, you remember it from, there's 1820, it was built in 1814. You can see it was a national school in the Victorian era. It was never listed to be protected, never listed, even though it was part of the public school system and under the Northern Ireland government. And so it was then handed over to a training provider called Melbourne Training. And you can see, you can see some of the kids here. And there's one of the Calderwoods, who stayed in the area, tried to stay in the area. It was then, mysteriously, it then was defunded. It was then sold, but the funds were split up between charities, okay? It was then burnt and knocked down in 2 days flat. So a school that had been there, had been funded by the Biggar family, on land given by Lord Donegal, the Brown family had helped promote, had lasted all those years, was flattened in 2 days flat. And the person who did it was a former pupil of the school who said, I'm rich enough to buy the school and I'm rich enough now to knock it down. For me personally, it still chokes me. It still chokes me. And this is why I'm hoping that the lottery fund will be able to recreate these buildings as part of augmented reality and tell the story of Brown Square once again. It's not all bad news. I took this photograph today. Although it's a 360-degree photograph, so we're looking down Brown Street. This is number 29 Brown Street, where, do you remember the Donnelly family, where the IRA had thrown a bomb in the 1920s? And so it's still there. It's still there today. There's the old Sackville Court there. There's the Peace Lane. That's the original Peace Lane there from the 1920s. Okay, it's now got corrugated tin there, but that is essentially the original Peace Lane. And as you can see, these are really good quality houses. They're houses that are built for the people. They're not of a single type. They are comfortable inside. I know, I live in one. And they reflect, and they're also mixed, because Brown Square now is a mixed population. So it's not just that pure loyalist area that you would have seen the 12 banners up. The paramilitaries come down once a year and put flags up, but it's really a gesture, because the new apartments that are being built will completely remove all of that. And here you can see I've merged this photograph. It's the old photograph of Abbey Street, and this is where the new apartments are going to be. And this was John Hagen's shop. As you can see, it was there in 1912. It's the same shop from here. So inside, that's the shop. So I've merged the photograph to show that Brown Square hasn't died. And it's thanks to people like Bobby Cairnduff and the Hagens and the Tones, Lily Tone, that the community spirit of Brown Square, the shared community spirit of Brown Square, is back. And that process will continue. I merged this photograph. Someone is moving out in Brown Street. And funny enough, I thought this was funny because that removal van is almost exactly where Henry Joy McCracken and the Sims brothers would have met to plan the 1798 rebellion in Hayes Tavern. And I thought it was ironic, but you know, it's a story of what Brown Square is going to be for the future, because whenever that person moves out, it's a private house and it'll become an Airbnb or it'll be a rent to buy. But who it'll be, that'll not be gate posted by the housing executive or anyone. It'll just be whoever needs that house or who can afford to buy that house. And so that really concludes the story of Brown Square. But before I leave you, I just want to recap some of the people that you've met. You know, there's John Brown. You're going to go and visit his grave. You know, as you can see, they have him there listed as a major of the Belfast Battalion of the Belfast Volunteers. I'm up in the top left, and the reason I put that photograph in is I wanted to show what it was like to be a British soldier, active service in Northern Ireland. Because the picture on the left was the day I joined up, and the picture on the right was exactly 365 days later. So you learn to grow up fast in the British Army when you're on the streets of Belfast. There's the people who are no longer with us, who were part of our story. The Calderwoods, Tassie Calderwood, who died this year. Louis West, you've seen his mother in the photograph at the City Hall with all the women, you know, on VE Day. And Louis unfortunately died of COVID. He's one of our COVID victims. It's not all bad news, you know. There you have the Patterson family. You remember James, who won the military medal? Well, this is actually where their house stands. And if you're going past those barricades on your tours, please remember James Patterson, and also remember that the family still goes today. And these are the Calderwoods on St. Patrick's Day. And I'm sure if Emmanuel Come is on this call tonight, I'm sure he's hitting the ground laughing at this one. Because here you have people who would never have considered St. Patrick's Day to be one of their things. They would have avoided Carol's Bar and St. Patrick's Day. And I feel St. Patrick's Day also, and the wearing of the green, belongs to them. So it's a good news story. And to finish off, I always finish off with my grandson. And this is Francis Finn. And so that's just a big thank you to everyone who has made this project what it has been. The Gareth Boyle and the Heritage Lottery Fund for providing the means to do this. The John Gray, who's the evaluator, who'll be compiling all the materials. The Professor Richard Grayson, who I hope to be working with on another addition to this project, along with Jerry McClure. To Professor Edward Burke for his invaluable information on the British Army activities. To Nick Barton for Mr. Woods, Lieutenant Colonel Woods, the Pattersons, the Wests, the Greys, the Hagans, the Cairnduffs, and the Calderwoods. And not least to Emmanuel Comez, who's on the call tonight. And Emmanuel is an ex-prisoner from a Republican background, and who I've worked with for the better part of about 6 or 7 years now, Emmanuel, I think, and who I'm really pleased I was able to include his materials tonight. To the Sterling family, the Bill who's on here tonight, because I got another mention in for his mummy, and I didn't know that they had to leave because of the troubles. The Jerry, who I hope is going to help me at Milltown, along with Professor Grayson, when we take the project on a wee bit. The British Newspaper Archive, who provide a lot of materials, in the Public Record Office. The Belfast Met, the tutors there, but not least to all of you who joined this course. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I have had a ball. I hope as you do your tours in the future and you pass Brown Square, that you remember some of the characters and the buildings and the things that you discovered. And if you give John a mention, or James a mention, or Emmanuel a mention, then you're keeping the heritage, a long heritage of 250 years alive. And that's the purpose of what I set out to do. So thank you very much, folks. And if you want any questions, I'll take them now.